Hey everybody, it's Eric Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with a friend, a very special guest, Sriram, Krishnan. Sriram, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I should say welcome back to the podcast. Of course, the other Sriram, Krishnan, wasn't invited to join us this time, but it's not personal.
He will never be invited again. Just like Highlander, there's only one who will survive, and it was me.
Yes. Okay. So speaking of survive, you are now surviving on your own. You are at Twitter. You are at Facebook. You are at Snap. You are now unemployed. Sriram, how does it feel?
It feels weird, I have to admit. I wish I had a very pithy, clean-cut response to this. I left Twitter in December. This is now, I would say, the last week of January or first week of February.
You left to be a full-time thought leader, right? I'm just kidding.
I met someone for coffee recently, and they asked me whether you're a full-time thought leader on Twitter, and I was horrified. I was like, "This is what I've become." My parents are going to be so ashamed of me. It feels a bit weird in the sense that I had like a fantastic time at Twitter over the last few years, and I wrapped up my time there at the end of last year, and now I'm kind of doing a combination of investing, some thought leadering on Twitter. Oh gosh, that's such a terrible phrase. And then kind of like helping out some companies and working on some side projects. So it feels a little bit weird to not have a very set routine, and I'm kind of figuring out my way into it. But it's been also fun. I have like a 1-year-old baby at home, and that's been fun to kind of like play with her and spend more time with her, and I kind of appreciating that a lot.
Totally. Let's talk about those three companies, because now you're not a public exec. You could say what you really feel or don't have to worry about.
Yes, Sriram Krishnan reveals all will be the title of this podcast.
Exactly. You don't have to worry about blowback. Let's see. You mentioned that Snap is a bizarro FB from DC Comics. Compare sort of FB, Twitter, Snap. How do you make sense of the different companies and the cultures? And let's get into it.
It's interesting because all these companies are iconic, amazing companies run by amazing founders. And I think when you're outside Silicon Valley or outside of our little world, you can often think of them as similar. You can often classify them as large social media companies. But when I was on the inside, one of the things I really wanted to do, and one of the reasons I picked working at Snap and working at Twitter, was I wanted to optimize for learning. And I wanted to go learn how to do things differently. And what I saw was you can build very similar products, but using very different culture, very different organizational mechanisms. So one way to think about it is, here are these three companies which seem similar on the outside, but on the inside are very different. And I think there are a few patterns which come out of this. And these are some of my pithy learnings. One way to think about it, I think, is each company is a reflection of their founder or founders, where the founders really imbue these organizations with so much of what makes them work. For example, I think one of the things I like to talk about is how Facebook and Snap are very different. If you look at, say, Facebook, I think one of the things Mark has always been really amazing at is he is incredibly strategic, incredibly focused on what is the most impactful thing to be done, incredibly focused on measuring the outcomes to make sure the things he's working on have high impact. And I think a lot of Facebook culture is shaped around that. You see this at everything from how they pick what they want to work on, how they pick, what to stop working on, and basically, the core of their organizational culture. And you can kind of deep dive into. Snap, on the other hand, is very different, because I think Evan comes from such a creative background, and he has such a great intuitive feel for what makes companies work or what makes products work. And a lot of what makes Snaps work is, hey, let's give people these really creative tools and let's focus on that. And not really obsess over the data, but really obsess over a creative, intuitive leap. For example, like one of the things I like to tell people is, if you look at something like Snap Stories and Lenses, there is no framework, there is no metric There is no jobs to be done framework that will lead you to that kind of product innovation. That requires a creative jump and intuiting out how people are worried to express themselves, intuiting out how people want to capture themselves on camera and bring that to a digital artifact. And I think that's really hard to do from a very metrics-driven culture. So in some ways, I think these companies are in the same business, but internally they're very different. Twitter is incredibly also very different. If you kind of think of 3 points of a triangle, they're very different. I think Twitter comes from a place of we are serving the public conversation. We are focused on certain very fundamental first principles. And how do we make sure every single decision we make tracks to those first principles? And these are very public. If you go listen to any one of Jack's multiple podcast interviews, you're going to see him talk about these first principles. And that is how they operate on the inside. So, I kind of like to do some organizational anthropology. I don't know whether it's the right phrase, but kind of study these organizations. And it's fascinating to see how these are very different on the inside.
It's almost, imagine if, Evan had been running Facebook, or Mark had been at running Snap, or Jack had been running one of the other ones. It's just fascinating to think how the companies might be different.
Yes, and I think sometimes you do get those counterfactual timelines. For example, I would say if you look at, say, how stories has developed over time, at some point of time, there were probably similarities between how Instagram stories or Snap stories at work or Facebook stories at work. But over time, I would say they've kind of diverged and forked off into their own worlds. But yes, I think it's really hard to see It's really hard to imagine these leaders running these other companies, because so much of these companies are a personification of what makes them such amazing founders.
So what do you think people underappreciate or get wrong about these companies? What do people underestimate or get wrong about Snap, Facebook, Twitter?
Well, I think each company is an ocean, which we can dive into. I think to deep dive into one, I think if you think about Twitter, I think one of the things that I really got to admire about Jack is his focus on building things from first principles. He's always insistent that anything that the company does should be deliberate and should ladder up from the very key principles the company operates on. Whether it be how, say, product decisions are made, whether it be how organization decisions are made, whether it be how content and policy decisions are made. And I think it's a little hard to maybe see this on the outside, because these companies can sometimes seem opaque, or maybe you're not very paying much attention. But on the inside, I think one of the things Jack brings is certain clarity of thought and focus on first principles. So, and I think one of the challenges is often like seeing these companies from the outside is you don't see the internal debates about, hey, every single decision, how does it map into this quasi-constitutional framework which ladder from certain first principles? I think that's really often hard to see from the outside. I think the second thing from hard to see from the outside is these are really large companies now. It is very easy to say company X or company Y thinks X or Y or Z. But on the inside, these are many people, many organizations with often many conflicting incentives and agendas on the inside. So I think that's often not seen on the outside, because you can often portray them as one entity, but on the inside, there are multiple different people who have a diverse range of opinions.
Yeah. And without being concrete about it, what is an example, without being too revealing, what's an example of a conflicting agenda that could theoretically happen in one of these companies that sort of will give the listener a greater appreciation for the challenges of getting something done?
Well, I think one interesting discussion, and this has happened like a little bit back in time, I don't think it's super controversial, is I like to think about when Facebook first launched autoplay video. Yeah. So, for a lot of your listeners might be much younger than we are, but way back in the day, when you actually had to open up a video on your mobile phone or an app, there was usually this big play button, you'd click on it and then it would play. And circa, I would say 2013, 2012, Facebook wanted to go, there were certain teams at Facebook who were experimenting with making those videos auto-playable, which is when you scroll through in feed, these videos would start playing automatically. Now, on the inside, and I'm picking this because it seems like a small product decision, but at the time, it was very controversial. Number one, hey, do people have the bandwidth to make this work? Are we going to eat through people's bandwidth? Are we going to just buffer and not be able to deliver a good experience? That was number one. Number two was a question of, hey, is this just going to dominate people's experience? Like you scroll and all of a sudden you see this crazy moving pictures, is this a thing that people really want? And there's kind of this long, list of questions. Another question was, if we do something like this, is it going to take away something core to how Facebook is operating, the likes, comments, shares. And there were many schools of thought on this. And I think in the end, I think it was Mark's thesis that, look, over time, bandwidth is going to get better. We want to give people better tools to express themselves. Yeah. So we're going to roll this out. We're going to roll this out as a constrained test, but we want to roll this out and we'll see what happens. So, and I'm massively oversimplifying what was a long, multi-month, maybe even more than that, discussion among many different organizations, many different teams inside Facebook. But that's a kind of a small example on the outside where you seem like something which seems just like, hey, Facebook just decided to do X. Yeah. On the inside was a very complex decision. The other, maybe the more recent relevant example I like to think about is Twitter moving to 280 characters.
Yeah.
So I love this because I can take no credit for it. All the work was done before I joined the company. But when Jack was trying to get me to join Twitter, we had dinner and he's like, hey, I want to show you something. And he pulls out his phone and he says, look, we are thinking of moving Twitter to 280 characters, which made me go like, whoa, like, this was huge because Twitter was known for 140. Yeah. There were so many things about 140 characters. And this seems so fundamental. And he asked me, like, what do you think? And I remember at the time telling him, look, I don't care what the data says. You can always roll it back. But it's symbolic and important that Twitter is making changes, like these core big changes. Now, on the inside, as you can imagine, there are many schools of thought about, hey, what happens? Are we going to lose some core essence that makes Twitter magical? I mean, Twitter is all about being brief, but are we going to lose something magical? There is no easy way to test this. You can't actually A/B test giving a few people 280 characters and then give everyone a 140. That doesn't work because the way the networks are set up. Now, there's a lot of good data to back up why this is a good idea. Twitter had studied how people in Japan were using Twitter, and Japanese language, and I could be butchering this, has almost twice the information density of English, and you could see how people express more. And that is kind of a proof point, but you never really knew until you launched it. And honestly, it requires some level of guts and fortitude to go say we're going to go for it. Now, on the outside, I'm sure this, like a lot of these decisions, there was this big protest. There were all these opinions about, hey, this is going to shake up the magic of Twitter. But now history tells us that, not only it was, it didn't kind of remove the magic, it actually opened up a lot more people and a lot different kinds of conversations. There was actually a blog post Twitter published about maybe 6 to 8 months ago about like how, 280 characters has been really good for the company. So that's an example of on the outside, you don't see the internal debates of these decisions, but on the inside, it's often chaotic.
Yeah. A couple more questions on each company, then we'll move to other topics. On Facebook, people often bring up sort of the Cambridge Analytica, sort of the fake news stuff, filter bubbles. How much of those concerns are totally overstated versus what are the real concerns Facebook has brought up? Another way of asking is, do you think they've made a crucial mistake in the last few years? Or put another way, if you were Zuck for a few years, what would you do differently? What would you change?
That's a hard question. For many reasons, I think one of them is I was at Facebook, the time when some of these systems were built. So maybe I'm biased and too close to the question. I think there are a few things going on. First is, I think we now know that, back in 2016, Facebook didn't really realize the extent of the threat of misinformation, the threat of what was happening with the Russians, and it just didn't realize like the extent of that. Now there are many conflicting thoughts on should Facebook have been on should have understood it themselves? Should the U.S. government have engaged with them and warned them about say the IRA or the GRU going after them? There are many schools on thought of that, but one of the things is like everyone in Facebook acknowledged that, hey, back in 2016, we didn't actually, realize the total extent of this. And I think to a large extent from what I read on the outside and listening to folks like, say, Alex Stamos, you're seeing they've actually really caught up in 2020 and like putting these defenses in place to stop really bad actors from going after them. So I think that's one. I think the second is, which I think like even Mark talks about, is Facebook now has a different stance on privacy than what they had, say, 2012, 2013.
That was a sort of strategic decision.
I'm not sure it is a strategic is one word. I think 2012, 2013 was a different time. So if you remember, if you go back then, one of the things that Facebook was often criticized for was being a walled garden. There was this big push that, hey, if you're an app developer, Facebook has this walled garden where you can't really reach in and build apps. And one of the reasons that Facebook platform was built was to give people this ability, hey, if you want to build an app which uses millions of hundreds of millions of people, and you want to build an app which is social, instead of building your own graph, build it on top of Facebook. And I think now, so one, I think, is to realize the context in which some of these experiences and apps were built. Because back then, it was fantastic. It opened up so many great experiences. I remember opening up Spotify and being able to see what my friends were playing. That was a kind of a great experience, right? Or being able to log into apps without having to remember new username password. So I'm actually a big fan of what Facebook platform built. And again, I'm too close to this because I was, I worked there during the time. But I think now, in retrospect, I think Facebook's now realized that, hey, maybe people didn't totally understand how their data was being used, which may be clear in retrospect, but at the time it was a different era, different place. But I think across all of this, I think for me the most interesting question is one of human agency. So I think there are two schools of thought. One school of thought is that, hey, I would say essentially human beings can't be trusted with what they consume on social media at scale. That there needs to be some filter, some kind of editorial control, which tries to figure out what is right, what is wrong, and acts as a little bit of a gatekeeper. I think that's one school of thought. I think the other school of thought is that we trust people to have agency over their information diet. And we're going to give them a lot of context. We're going to tell them, hey, these are what, say, fact checkers say. This is what, say, reputable or news organizations say. But at the end of the day, if you want to spend all day reading about John Wick like I do, great. That's awesome, right? I'm really excited for the next John Wick movie, which opens the same day as the next Matrix movie, by the way. So I think these are two schools of thought. And I think in some ways it's kind of like a broader social question than a Facebook question, which is, we never had a time in society where people could basically pick their information sources at scale. And I don't think it's a Facebook question. I think it's much a broader one for like all of us to ponder on.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Do you think the Oculus thing makes sense, or the broader idea of we need to own a platform?
So I have a plug here. So one of the things I do on my site, thank you. Thanks. Good segue. You're such a great host. One of the things I do on my site is I collect a bunch of memos, or at least public memos. And one of the public memos I have is from Mark, Zuck, talking about Facebook's case for buying Unity, which never happened, but it's kind of an interesting artifact of a certain point in time. I think it makes sense for a few reasons. One is, in a broader sense, Mark's bet, I believe, is in the long term, VR and AR are going to be a thing. Maybe we don't know exactly what the timeline is. Maybe we don't know what the killer app is, but over time, it is going to be a thing. And if you're in the business of connecting people like Facebook is, it makes sense to have a call option when those experiences get built. I think that's one. I think the second, from a more strategic perspective, is if you look at Facebook as a company, they've always had to rely on other tech companies to deliver their experiences to you. Like, let's say you open up Facebook right now. If you do it on your phone, you're doing it with a device made by Apple or a device which is heavily influenced by Google. If you do it on your desktop, you're doing it through a browser, run probably by Google or Microsoft or someone else. So Facebook's always had a middleman where that middleman kind of, it influences or shapes their access to you. And I think it's in any company's best interest to have direct access to their consumers and go bare metal. So you can see why it makes strategic sense for them to say, hey, if this VR thing becomes a big deal over a long period of time, we should probably have like direct access over this. So this is kind of my read of the situation from the outside of why it makes super sense for them.
Yeah. Their attempt to create a phone a long time ago didn't work. Should they have tried to buy Nest, or I'm just looking at other potential platforms that they could have either bought or potential built?
One of my pet theories is, and I don't think it's ever been talked about before, or even inside of Facebook. So I think the one question Facebook really missed out on is building a browser. So if you think about it right now, Chrome seems like such a given. It dominates the market. And of course, there's a mini resurgence with Edge and Brave and Firefox, but Chrome is still dominant player. But if you go back, say, 2007, 2008, it was Microsoft Internet Explorer, which was the dominant player by far. And if you remember the Chrome launch with the comic book, it was this new entry on the market. And I think back then, Google's strategic thinking was not to win the market as much as to make sure there's not one dominant player. Because Google had a similar problem to what Facebook has now, which is Microsoft was brokering their access to their customers. So they didn't want to have one party have all this strategic power on them. So it was their interest to almost push for that layer to be a commodity, which I think they really effectively did. And in fact, turned out that they built such a great experience that they won the market. But if you go back in time, you ask yourself, why should a search engine company own a web browser? That seems like kind of like a bizarre question. And you can say, well, if they can own a web browser, it might as well make sense that a social media company can own a web browser. In fact, it might even make more sense because you can tie you into a social layer. There are a lot of things that you do with people which are inherently social in a web browser, much more than, say, with search. So I think Facebook, and I have no idea what Mark's thinking on this, but my pet theory is like one strategic sort of trick that they missed circa 2009, 2010 was either buying or building a browser on their own.
Wow. Does Libra make sense? Would you have prioritized it in the way that they have?
Well, I think one of the things I really admire about Facebook, and I think about this when I talk to founders or when I think about starting a company, is they're so mission driven. Which, by the way, actually, it's a good answer for one of the questions you asked a bit earlier on, which is like, what do people on the outside misunderstand? Yeah. Is that these companies are very mission driven companies. Yeah. They are often not motivated by, say, profit. Not that making money isn't important to, buy the data centers and, hire people, but they're often primarily motivated by mission, right or wrong. Yep. And I think if you look at it through that lens, it makes a lot of sense that, hey, we are in the business of connecting people, and building these communities, and banking and working with money is something which is really hard. It's very hard in large parts of the world. There's a lot of friction, and it makes a lot of sense that is something you do in the place where you connect with your friends. So through that lens, it makes a lot of sense. I think the challenge has been how do you do that in a time when trust in Facebook, has come to its challenges with Cambridge Analytica and everything else. I think so. Timing of it maybe, might make it harder for them. But from a mission perspective, I think it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Let's talk about Snap. Did Instagram stories and Facebook basically sort of mimicking Snap's features mean that Snap's growth potential is limited? Do they have to move into other services for their demographic, i.e., insurance or something, just the full stack, services for their demographic? Do they have to hope that they get the next generation as well? What's your take on Snap, and what would you be doing if you were Ev?
Well, I don't know what I'd be doing if I were Evan, but I think he's doing a really good job. I actually think Snap and Instagram are really different. And the idea that Snap stories and Instagram stories are similar it's true at some level, obviously. But if you look at it much deeper, if you look at how people use Snap, I think a lot of what powers Snap usage is people just chatting all the time and, messaging each other in such a fluid, vibrant way. That's one. And second is Snap is so much more intimate. It is about, forming these small, groups of friends that you hang out in class, you're a bit bored, you're kind of like snapping them all the time. You're sending hundreds of snaps back and forth. Now, I think that as a use case or a job to be done is very different from, say, the Instagram story job to be done. So the first one I would say is, I think the Venn diagram between these two companies and who they're going after definitely has some overlap, but they're actually essentially serving, I think, very different use cases. And my evidence point for that is if you look at, say, Snap's earnings over the last couple of years, and listen to Evan's comments or, the Snap leadership comments, they talked about, for example, that how their redesign after a couple of years ago, slowed their growth. And then after that, as they've kind of made their Android app better and, fixed international or prioritize international, their growth is back up again. So, which kind of tells you that Snap is on a journey, which is on its own path apart from Instagram. So I actually think, those two companies are actually serving very different needs. And even now, when I talk to kids in high school or talk to founders who are much, much younger than me, which is often annoying. When did we get so old, Eric? You see that, there is a space for both of these products on people's screens.
Totally. Let's talk about Twitter. So Twitter is confusing to most people.
No.
Some people
just open it up and type whatever comes in your mind.
Exactly.
That's it.
Well, that's what I do.
Please do.
Yes.
As a stockholder, I highly endorse that.
Yes. Some people say that Twitter Moments is the most important newspaper in the world and that it guides what journalists do. Some people say Twitter is an absolute dumpster fire and it's what got our president elected, and they blame it for that. What are the challenges at Twitter? What's going on at Twitter? What has to happen at Twitter?
I love Twitter as a product, as a company. One of the reasons I went to work there was after I was done with Snap, I wasn't really sure whether I wanted to get back into an operating role again. Yeah. I was starting to dabble in investing, which I'm doing more of now, and I wasn't really sure. And one of the things which drew me to Twitter was, apart from, I used it a lot personally, which is probably annoyingly evident to some of your listeners, is that it felt it had a really important purpose in the world. So Twitter's purpose is to serve the public conversation. Yeah. You hear Jack talk about this all the time. And I think at the time, given, say, the elections or how Twitter was such a key part of culture, when I was talking to Jack, I felt like, hey, this is a place where I could have an impact. And this is a place which is actually having impact on the world at scale in serving the public conversation. So, and I think that was true when I decided to join. I think that is true till now, which I think Twitter is the heart of what makes the public conversation. So I think that's one. I think, and in some ways, I think they are even more relevant now in the sort of charged times that we live in than before. Because over time, you see the need to have these public conversations in these public spaces. And I think Twitter is even more relevant now than it used to be. I think the questions for Twitter are honestly, and this is something you hear them talk about all the time, is when you have this, basically having all of the world speaking together, how do you shape healthy incentives? I think all of us have experiences when you have these amazing magical moments on Twitter. Like, for example, my favorite moment, 2016 NBA Finals, LeBron comes back to win 4-3. Let's never forget that. I just want to I want to mention on every podcast I'm on. I just want to mention that on every podcast. And so if you remember that moment was magical on Twitter. It exploded. Maybe not magical if you're a Golden State Warriors fan, which is why I also want to remind you folks on this podcast. But there were memes, there were GIFs, it felt magical, and that's kind of a fun pop culture moment. But I think we have all experienced those moments which feel magical. Yeah. On the other hand, I think we have all experienced moments when you say something and all of a sudden somebody you don't know is yelling at you, and and you're like, well, why is this happening? And I think I think Twitter's path, for the last few years has been, how do we shape these incentives on the platform to be healthy and to have a healthier conversation? And this is hard because you're doing it at such scale. You're doing it across such different kinds of, communities and conversations. And it's a really, really hard problem. So for example, one of their recent product launches, which again, I had no part to play with, but I'm a huge fan of, is now you can hide replies to your tweets, where this kind of going back to the example of, hey, why is someone yelling at me? Well, now if you feel like, hey, I'm saying this and I don't want this person to take over the space or be toxic or unhealthy, you can hide these replies. Now, Twitter is going to say, look, this person hidden these replies. If you still want to, you can still go read them. So that's kind of an interesting question, where Twitter is like trying to balance healthy conversations, but also trying to make sure that it takes into account like all the different kinds of people that are involved. So I think Twitter's big challenge / opportunity is going to be, how do we make this conversation healthier? But I'm a huge fan. You're going to see me talking about LeBron every single day on Twitter.
So if you can wave a wand and change any lever or any feature or add or edit or take away at Twitter to help improve this goal that they also share, what might that look like?
So, here's a story which I haven't told anybody before. So when Jack was talking to me about joining the company, he asked me actually something similar, which was, what would you do if you had a magic wand? And one of the analogies I use, and I don't think this is about Twitter, I think this is true for any, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are, working in social platforms or things which have social mechanics, where I think a lot of these social platforms are analogous to, let's call them restaurants. Yeah. So let's say you are going to, what's a very fancy restaurant you like, Eric? Give us a sneak peek at your life.
I'm pretty low key, Sriram.
That's not true. He's wearing a tux right now with a martini in his hand.
Let's say Fleming's Palo Alto. It just came to mind.
Let's say it's fancy, or let's say French Laundry, right?
Okay, let's do it.
Really fancy. You'd probably wear, say, a suit there. You'd probably be really dressed up, and you're probably not going to get up and say dance on the table.
Yep.
I've never seen that done. I'm assuming it's not a thing. On the other hand, if you're at, say, a sports bar and let's say you're at Super Bowl, and let's say a Super Bowl viewing party yesterday, it's probably okay to go yell and shout and be a little raucous. Same with dress code. You can go to, say, a Hawaiian beach shack and you're going to show up in like flip-flops and shorts and it's going to be okay. So I think every restaurant has a decorum or a code of conduct or a certain aesthetic. And I think that, for any successful community, you need to have something similar. What are the rules of engagement? What is the code of conduct? And the community can pick. The community can say, hey, look, we encourage vigorous disagreement. Or the community can pick, hey, we encourage things which are only positive and supportive. But whatever it is, I think the community has to go pick one. And one of my, magic wand waving things for Twitter was, how do we get people on Twitter to express more gratitude, to express more about what makes them happy or what makes them laugh. One of my pet theories is a lot of things on Twitter are conflict many emotions. Like if you hit a like button, the like button on Twitter could conflate, hey, I like this, love this, show me more of this, which is often why I like something because, I'm like, hey, show me more from this author, show me more of this content. It can mean I endorse this. It used to mean, hey, I save this for later. And even for it inspires a positive emotion. It could mean it made me laugh. I learned something from this. There are so many different things which could happen. And I think there's some value in trying to break those apart. So, for example, I'm just like making something up here. Imagine a social platform where you had, hey, I'm thankful for this, or hey, I learned something from this button. No, of course, the number of tweets or the number of Instagram posts or the number of TikTok videos where uses could be minimal. But I think you could then split out some of these incentives and figure out, okay, what are kinds of communities which have gratitude as a core part? What are kinds of communities which have humor as a core part? And then you can do really interesting things there. So I think one of my, magic wand things is, how do I get people on Twitter to split out the kind of emotions they want to express?
Yeah. It's interesting. There are two presidential candidates that I think are uniquely enabled by Twitter, or sort of the ethos that Twitter represents, or the internet more broadly. One is obviously Donald Trump in terms of being, I'll insert my editorial here, very divisive, and that being very good for engagement on Twitter. But the next is more of a fringe candidate, Andrew Yang, which I think he's doing more so on the meme side, just being immensely funny, being very personal. There's something about the meme and laughing, and sort of, amusing ourselves to death is a book that Keita Boyer mentioned that sort of predicted this a couple years ago, that makes certain people more tolerable. Like, there was this, do you know Darko Milicic?
No.
He was the second pick in the NBA draft in 2005. He was a total bust. He never went anywhere. Same draft as LeBron and Carmelo Anthony. But some people say if he was around today, he would have been this sort of legendary meme character. But there was something about 2005 that just didn't appreciate meme culture, or they didn't have the tools to spread meme culture.
Joel Embiid, for example, fantastic meme culture person.
Yeah. Do you, let's take Andrea, do you take that? How do you think about the way the medium shapes the conversation, in terms of, memes, but also just things that are meant to be funny or laughed at, or how do you think about that? Like, is there Andrew Yang without Twitter, or?
Well, I think, I'm a big fan of, have you read Martin Gurry's
Yes.
Revolt of the Public?
Yep.
I'm a big fan of that book. So for those of you who don't know, Martin Gurry is actually a retired CIA analyst who has a fantastic blog, and he wrote a book back in, I think, 2014 or 2013 called The Revolt of the Public, which basically has at its core thesis, and I might butcher this, you should hold me honest to it, is, hey, the public, is going through this very secular change where in the past, your access to information to the ruling class, be it politicians, be it folks in the media, were brokered through certain few institutions. But over time, thanks to the rise of the internet, you had direct access to politicians, media figures, celebrities. So one, there was no middleman. Second, you were kind of forming these communities on your own and forming these social movements on their own without being brokered by the central gatekeepers. And this book was written in 2014, but in some ways it kind of predicts the rise of Trump. It predicts the rise of, I would say, like a lot of folks like international elections, which I think, have been predicted by that. And it's a fantastic book, and it really helped give me a framework to think about how a lot of these politicians have been able to use Twitter. So in some way, I think if you look at someone like an Andrew Yang, he's and I think there's many others of this nature. I would say if you look at the last couple of years, folks on either side, I think AOC, for example, has been, phenomenal as using Twitter to get her message out. Andrew Yang is definitely an example. There are lots of folks, actually international, also who are like really good examples. And I think in each of the cases, I think what Andrew is able to do is he's basically in some ways a one-man media organization. So instead of having to rely on just, say, the debates or just, say, winning endorsements from newspapers, he's able to get his message directly to the public. So, for example, one of the things which I believe really helped his campaign was him going on podcasts. He did this podcast tour, many different podcasts, including Joe Rogan and others. Now, this is an entire media ecosystem, whether you agree with these podcast, hosts or not, which never really existed. But, Yang is able to take this message directly to the public. So I think that's one. The second, I think, one thing I think he's gotten a lot better on Twitter, and this is just from me, observing this, is trying to figure out what works. So, for example, something which makes Twitter work is being creative, being in the moment, sort of short and pithy, but really creative. And I think what he's been able to do is really iterate on his messaging. Because if you go back in time and say, look at his messaging from a year and a half ago, he's still talking about UBI and still really same issues, but it was much more traditional. But now, you see him trying to play basketball, showing off his jumper, with the right hashtag. So I think he's kind of also iterated very quickly on what messages work for social media. So when I talk to not politicians, but often people ask me, how do I make Twitter or social media work for me? And my key lesson to them is always, look, you never know what is going to work unless you iterate very quickly and learn. And so you have to be willing to set your ego aside, set aside what you think of as well-known best practices, and just go out and iterate on what the message is, iterate on what you're using as a distribution mechanism, and always learn. And I think Yang has been doing that really well. So, for example, one person who's not a politician from close to our world who I think has been doing this really well recently is Naval Ravikant.
Yeah.
And so Naval, if you go back, say, 8-9 years ago, had a very well-read blog. He was already well-known on the Silicon Valley tech scene for, I don't think whether he started AngelList then, but he had this blog, I think it was called Startup Boy, on WordPress.
Angel Hacks.
Angel Hacks, yes. He was very well-known. But I think over time, of course, he obviously built something incredible with AngelList, but I think over time, he kind of understood what made Twitter work, in these kind of very short, fortune cookie-esque, tweets. The most famous one was how to get wealthy. And one of the things I like about Naval is he's always testing. So if you look at his content now, you see him do these mini podcasts, right? And everyone's doing podcasts. But if you look at Naval's podcast, he's kind of understood the format where he takes out these little segments and then he overlays them with text. So let's say you're opening up Twitter, and let's say you're listening to Eric Thornberg, because obviously you should listen to Eric Thornberg immediately. You should stop what you're doing and listening to it. But you probably have to pop in your AirPods or find a quiet moment and, listen to some audio. But in Naval, you don't have to, because what he does is you have the text overlaid as a snippet, so you can just consume it right then and there, or you can save for later. So I think he's the master, or he's one of the best I've seen recently at trying to optimize distribution mechanisms. And I think that's a lesson for pretty much anyone. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners are trying to figure out how to build distribution. It's like always iterate, always try and learn with what the medium is giving you.
Yeah, no, I love that. Another example, of course, is Mark Andreessen's invention of the tweet storm.
Yes. I remember, I think it was, I believe it started on like January 1st of one year. And it was not a feature which was built into Twitter. He just kind of invented it, and it solved so many problems for Twitter in some ways, because you had tweet storms, you never really needed Twitter to build, say, long form writing, because you could just do it to the tweet storm, and tweet storms are more natural to the platform in so many ways. I'm always a fan of trying to understand these new distribution mechanism hacks, or what really makes new channels work. For example, like one of the things I've been doing recently is I have this newsletter which I've been writing, and what I found really effective is writing a tweet storm of just something and then like linking to my newsletter at the end of it. And for some reason, when people find a tweet helpful, it goes really viral, and I wind up getting like a lot of new people showing up on my newsletter, which I generally don't find do. So I'm a big fan of just studying this.
Totally. The what's happening with Blue Sky or Twitter's sort of decentralized social media visions? How do you view that? And then maybe there's no podcast without bringing in Balaji. Balaji, how do you think his decentralized social media views overlap or differ from yours?
Well, Balaji is probably the if you can imagine an axis of how decentralized people think the world is going to be, Balaji at the furthest end of the axis. In fact, he's probably running ahead of the axis, and the axis is trying to sprint and keep up with him. My take on Blue Sky is, going back to something we spoke about earlier, Jack is really, really good at focusing on first principles. And I think one of the things he believes is A, everything on the internet lasts forever, and B, the real innovation or the real opportunity often lies in building incredible relevance and recommendation algorithms. And if you listen to him talk on, say, Rogan or other places, you often hear him talk about this. And if you look at Blue Sky through that lens, it makes a lot of sense. For example, instead of, Twitter or say Facebook or TikTok or Instagram being a stack which gives you hosting of content. I mean, right now, if you post a tweet, Twitter gives you hosting. If you post a TikTok video, are you on TikTok, Eric?
I'm not yet.
You might kill it. Like, Eric on TikTok could be a real thing. Yeah. I'm going to pre-announce that Eric's going to show up on TikTok.
I'm going to ask you for a strategy session. I don't know what I would do on TikTok.
Well, I feel you'll be natural at it. So yeah, stay tuned for that, folks. No, but I think in each of these platforms, they give you hosting. They give you a certain moderation policy of what is allowed, what isn't allowed. They give you a certain verification policy, who gets the blue check mark and who doesn't. They give you a certain, AI relevance and recommendation algorithms, which often keep changing, but they're very different. And it's kind of a stack, which is, one size meets all in some ways. And the analogy I often use is think of Gmail. If you think of Gmail is built on top of SMTP, IMAP, POP3, all the email protocols that we know. But if you look at the Gmail experience when you open it up into your browser or your phone, it collapses so many things. One, it layers on top of these protocols. Two, it gives you recommendation algorithms because it sorts spam and not spam. It sorts out things into like what is social, what is a mailing newsletter offer, etc., etc. And it collapses a lot of things into one great experience. But if you wanted to, you could experience Gmail without any of that. You can always connect Mail.app or Thunderbird or Outlook and just get regular email directly. And when you look at social networks today, I think of them as Gmail, but without having SMTP, without having POP, without having those core protocols open. And which is why I think Blue Sky is really interesting. So what Blue Sky lets people do, and look, this is super early. Like all we have right now is Twitter just announced they're going to try and find somebody to work on this. So who knows? We're talking like many years out. But I think what's really interesting is opening up innovation for people to say, hey, if you don't like how Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or any platform is building their own recommendation algorithms, come build your own. And there's going to be a marketplace of some sort, or where you can go compete on who has the best, say, recommendation algorithm. Or, for example, another common question which comes up is verification. Like, if you don't, say, approve of how any one of these companies is verifying people, go plug in your own algorithm. Like maybe Eric verifies people, and you all ping Eric to get verified on this new platform. So I think that's really interesting to see how you can split these out. And these are just examples that we know of. I think one of the things we have learned over time is when you build a platform, you open up ideas and applications which you haven't thought of, and so you could get like maybe a crazy new set of applications which we just haven't thought of before. So I think the whole thing is really, really interesting for all these reasons.
And to be clear, if you want to get verified, do ask Sriram. He'll help you out.
Eric, on TikTok.
Last question on Twitter. Could Twitter have been? I've already planned my TikTok tweet, by the way, for after this podcast. Could Twitter have been a $100 billion company? What's the best business case for how it becomes significantly bigger than it is today? Because there was a time where people were saying, "What happens to Twitter? Does it become a public utility? Does people have to buy it? Does it become private again?"
Let me try and answer this in this way. I still firmly believe that of all the companies, Twitter is the best position to capture the public conversation with the product they have, with the people they have, with the community that it has. It's the best poised to capture the public conversation.
But how do you capture the value from that?
Well, I think it starts first with actually capturing the conversation itself and making it healthy. And I think one of the things we learn is once you do that, you can figure out how to get the value out of it much later. Now, of course, Twitter's done a fantastic job over the last few years. They have a great team building ads and really figuring out how to get brands to be more active on Twitter, which I think is fantastic. But I think it really starts with shaping the public conversation, which is what they really focused on.
Do you think TikTok is a long-standing social media juggernaut, or do you think that one of these other platforms copies their features? And how do you think about the future of TikTok?
It's hard to say, first because I am not natively on it, and I'm always a little skeptical of over-intellectualizing these platforms. Yeah. I think all of these platforms capture a certain zeitgeist in a moment in time, a certain set of people, who don't want to be on the same platform as their parents, or, people older than them, who sadly now, I think, Eric, we are not the people older than him. And so it kind of captures something in moment in time. I think the question for TikTok would be, you have captured a certain aesthetic or a certain form of self-expression. One. Second, you have captured a certain graph, which is one to many, essentially. Yeah. Now, if I were them, and I have no idea how to think about this, is how do you then expand out of that? How do you expand out of that one single form of expression to other forms of expression? How do you expand from that one to many graph to maybe one to a few, one to one? So if you look at something like Instagram, right? If you think of an Instagram story, when they started, it was just the photographic community in San Francisco posting these really gorgeous photos, right? And over time, the kind of photos really grew. Then you had messaging, so it enabled one-to-one, small group conversations. Then you had different forms of expression start off with stories. So you kind of seen how, if you can imagine, say, a table of, how people, how many people do you want to communicate? And then the kind of self-expression or the kind of format you want to use. You can see how Instagram has kind of captured these adjacent spaces over time. And I think that would be the question for TikTok, because I do think there is a shelf life if you only stay with one form of expression and one form of graph over time. Because after some period of time, these folks are going to grow older, or the folks coming in are going to find it harder and harder to compete with the folks who are already at the top of TikTok. So that's one question. If I were them, I'd try to build adjacent spaces. The second is, I have this framework of thinking about it, which I think I give a lot of credit to Eugene Wei for, which is to think of a lot of these social platforms in terms of social currency. So one way to think about, say, any one of these social platforms is you have currency, you have followers, you have reach, you have a lot of people viewing your tweets, your videos, whatever they may be. You could easily have wealth inequality, to use this analogy, on your platform. And so let's say somebody shows up, a new teenager shows up 4 years from now on TikTok. Can he or she climb to the top of TikTok very quickly by being creative? Or are they going to look at TikTok and say, look, I can't play this game. The folks who are wealthy here are going to be wealthy forever. They're going to have tens, hundreds of millions of followers. I'm just going to go find a different game. So I think one of the things which makes social networks alive over a period of time, or keeps them alive, is finding ways to handle the social currency, or when new people come in, how do they have a path to building new social currency? So I think that's one interesting framework to look at, like any platform.
Yeah. You had this tweet that went viral recently, and you've had a lot of tweets that go viral recently. Most due to your full-time focus. Just kidding. But your Netflix tweet about product management interview question. So should it be editorial or algorithmic? What are the trade-offs? I want you to get into how you think about how you'd answer that question. And maybe before that, you can give a brief. Another thing you've had is around how social media is like fiscal policy. So maybe you can explain that, and maybe let's get into it.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for that. So on social media fiscal policy, I think kind of carries on from what I was just talking about, which is one of my pet pithy phrases, which often sounds good in dinner parties, is to think of like running a social media company as you're setting fiscal policy for a medium-sized country. And in a lot of ways, you have these large levers you can pull, which have large downstream effects, but you can't often really predict the downstream effects or measure them really cleanly. So for example, one way to think about social platform is you have people who are going to get reach, and how do you make sure that when new people show up on the platform, they have a path to getting reach too, or are they going to come over and they look like, hey, look, there's no path for me to get, like, if you're on Instagram today, do you have any shot of getting as big as a rock? Do you have any shot, if you're on, TikTok, do you have any shot of getting as big as the kids in Hype House? No, I don't know. But I think it's really key for the vibrancy of these platforms to give people such a path. So a little bit like, it's like handling fiscal policy. Like, how do you put taxes on the rock? Maybe Instagram says, hey, look, if you're new to the platform, we are going to give you, our feed algorithm is going to give you a little bit of a bump just to make sure that you have a path to reaching the rock, right? And maybe the rock is forced to be more creative and, post more just so that he just doesn't coast on his, zillion odd followers. So these are obviously very naive, pithy ideas, but I think there's some truth there about how do you manage reach and attention, which is really the core currency you have, and make sure that new members in the community, old members in the community, all, have their incentives aligned. So I think that's a really interesting problem. And, in my post, I talk about how we can then explore other parts of social media in terms of fiscal policy. For example, wealth inequality, we spoke about. I think taxation is thinking about like, hey, if you already have, let's say, The Rock, maybe are you going to work harder to reach your audience as opposed to somebody new who Instagram doesn't have access to and they want to make them happy? So I think it's an interesting model. Now, like all models, they are imperfect. So please don't tweet at me saying it's not fiscal policy because it's not money. It is not money. But I think it gives you an interesting tool or lens to think about it.
Let's go into the Netflix example. So how should people think about the trade-offs between editorial and algorithmic?
Yeah. So the question which you're referring to is, it's my second favorite interview question of all time. I'm always very hesitant to reveal my interview questions because when you reveal interview questions, it's harder. People can game you in interviews. So I'm never going to talk about what my most favorite. I'll tell you after we finish. I got it. But my second favorite PM interview question of all time was, imagine you're the PM of Netflix. And by the way, it doesn't have to be Netflix. I just picked Netflix because it's the company that a lot of people use and are familiar with. If somebody said they didn't know Netflix, I would say, okay, tell me about Airbnb. And the goal is not to quiz them on Netflix. And I would say, you are the product manager in charge of the Netflix home screen. And you have a lot of options for what content you can show. You can make a bunch of editorial choices, and you can show how, say Netflix pays a lot of money and gets The Irishman. You can just make sure everyone in America just sees The Irishman on top of the screen. Or you could go completely algorithmic, and you could say, we're going to let the algorithm decide, for example, what is the content that people are spending the most time on? And we're going to show you that. These are, by the way, extremely naive, pithy versions of what these decisions could be. And anyway, I asked them, if you're a PM, how would you think about it? And the reason why I love this question is it's because it's what I call an iceberg question, because it seems simple at the top. It seems like a UI question about, hey, are you going to pick algorithms or editorial? But what it really is, it's a question of values, of how do you balance, what the customer wants, how do you balance what the company wants, how do you balance what your partners want, and what your algorithms want. And first off, do you even know that there are all these different stakeholders in the ecosystem? Do you know, for example, that, there is Ted Sarandos is running a huge team, which is out there buying all this content, or there are a bunch of maybe, Martin Scorsese has it in his contract that, he should be highlighted, when Irishman goes out. I don't know. But first, the question is, do you even know, and can you map out the system in which is what Netflix world exists in? So I think, honestly, a lot of candidates don't even get this far, which is kind of mapping out the system. And in fact, if you even get this far, which is mapping out each player in the system and what they would want, I think you're ahead of, the median person who tries to attempt this. I think that's one. I think the second question is, if you kind of get beyond the sort of the systems level thinking around this, is what are Netflix's actual goals in this, right? What are their business goals? What are their customer goals? And what are you actually trying to optimize for if you're Netflix? Are you trying to just optimize for keeping people on the platform, getting them to watch the most content? I don't think so, because I don't think that leads you to the optimum, which would give you House of Cards or Stranger Things. So what it is that you're actually trying to optimize if you're Netflix? And second, how can you measure it, and what can't you measure? I think those are very interesting discussions. So, for example, you can talk about, hey, this is content that we know is retentive. This is content that we don't know, but we're going to take a bet that it is retentive, etc. So the question, I think, that putting a bounding box around what you're trying to optimize for and how to measure it, I think, is second. The third, I think, is one of my pet theories is that one way to compete with large platform companies is trying to build things that they can't measure. And another way to think about that is there are things that you can't measure and things you can't. And I think a lot of product decisions or business decisions is building a bounding box and constraining, both of these questions. For example, at Facebook, often when you go to Mark and you'd have, say, a question which is driven by data, which gives you one answer, and one driven by instinct, which gives you another answer, one common answer or resolution would be, okay, we're going to give you a budget, right? You have 10% to, go with your gut, or 20% to go with your gut, and we'll see what happens, because, we're not measuring the right thing. So in the Netflix case, one way to think about this is, okay, we're going to give you a budget, and where you have 30%, of home screen attention driven by editorial, and we're going to see what happens. So there's no right or wrong answer, but I think these are all interesting questions, like cultural questions, metrics questions, systems level questions. And I think figuring out the questions are often more interesting than what the answers are. By the way, you might have seen I slightly dodged answering what the actual answers are.
Yeah, of course. I want to close with some topics you've been thinking about recently. Truth as a service, stories as platform, Mr. Wolf for security. Get into any of those that you find interesting and want to leave the audience with.
Mr. Wolf for security. A long time ago, I got in trouble for an interview for saying something is the Mr. Wolf of X, and my PR person got really mad at me. So Mr. Wolf for security is like a pithy phrase, but one phenomenon I think a lot of us have seen over time is how untrustworthy your phone company is as a source of identity. We've seen a lot of famous people getting hacked, including, Jack, where somebody does a SIM port. And the scary thing, and I've spoken a lot of people in the security industry about this, is that you really can't stop it. Because in some ways the phone companies are trying to make phone porting, number porting as easy as possible, because the government has a lot of penalties for them if they don't actually support that. So their incentives are a little mixed in actually making it as secure as possible. And there's all these social engineering vectors that can come into play. So I think given the rise of SIM porting attacks, I think there's this big question of, hey, how do you actually prove you are you online? I think that's question one. Question two is, I think for a lot of us, we have a lot more at stake digitally than we have, let's say, for example, inside a physical home. For example, I think for me, if you take outside, of course, my family and the humans who live inside my home, I think that I have much more value with things I have digital access to. My bank account, my, crypto accounts, my social media maybe, than I have maybe, I think I have like a small amount of cash and, my laptops and computers at home. Please don't break into my home if you're listening to this. And so one way to think about it is, how do you then protect these digital assets, and what do you do when things go bad? So one of these terrifying scenario is, let us say you lose access to, I think the most terrifying scenario for any of us is one day you get a notification from Gmail saying somebody else is logged in. You're like, well, I never logged in. You open it up and then you find yourself locked out. Right? And then your phone's not working anymore because, somebody just imported you and you're just totally cut off. And probably the people you're going to reach to try and help you you can't probably reach them because you can't actually get access to devices where you can actually communicate with them. And this is actually what happens, by the way, if you get, attacked to one of these. So anyway, so I think these are really scary scenarios. And I think a lot of us, especially folks who are more online, worry about these. And I think there's an opportunity to fix them. And so my Mr. Wolf for security was about, let us say you had a person or a company which you could call and say, look, hey, I just got broken into, right? Somebody stole my Gmail account or pretending to me, help me. And this person, just like Mr. Wolf in Pulp Fiction, is like, you know what? I got it. You don't worry. I'm going to take care of things. They come to your house or wherever you are physically, and they validate your physical identity. Now, by the way, I think this is a very interesting problem in itself. One tweet of Dan Romero of ex-Coinbase fame, which I loved, was how you have Clear in the airports, which validate you physically. Yeah. Why can't we have that in like more places? Like, why can't I, log into, say, my Bitcoin account, my bank account using Clear, right? But imagine, for example, that this Mr. Wolf shows up at your house, and says, okay, you are actually Eric. Second is then they can actually assume, they can say proxy you to digital services. So for example, I actually don't know if any one of us got hacked by Gmail or got our Gmail accounts hacked. Who do I contact? How long will Google take to turn us around? I'm pretty sure one of us will try and find some friend of us at Google and be like, hey, please help me. This is actually me. But I'm pretty sure for the average person, they don't even know whom to contact. I don't actually know whom to contact. But let us say this Mr. Wolf could say, look, they can prove to Google that they have verified it is you, and they can take ownership of handling your affairs. So for example, they can say, okay, we are going to take this account, put this account on lockdown. We are going to restore access and then slowly try and, lock out the intruder, analyze damage, and give you back access. So now I actually think like this is a service which a lot of people in Silicon Valley would pay for. And I think as more and more people have more equity on their digital footprint than they do in their physical footprint, I think this is something which is really valuable. Now, the exact idea may not be as interesting, but I think there are elements in there. Putting a physical identity, having somebody who can, proxy you these digital services, and buying digital security insurance, just like you buy, home insurance. I think there's some interesting ideas in there.
I love it. In closing, or what do you want to leave us about what your investment thesis is, or where you're looking to invest to the audience?
Well, I'm still relatively new to investing. For me, it's about one is, do I have chemistry with the founder? Are they solving an interesting problem? And third is, have they really understood something deep about the problem, which a lot of other people haven't. So I think, those sound very pithy, but I think they often work for me. So for example, by the way, as an investor, I think I'm supposed to talk about my portfolio.
Oh, yes, of course.
That's what you're supposed to do, right?
Exactly.
All right, so,
Scale, Cameo.
well, I'm going to pick one which I think a lot of folks may not have heard of. One of the things I've been doing more is like investing in companies in India. We can go into some of the time about like how I think India is in this sort of this great way of consumer product innovation. And one company I met is called Kata Book. I'm sure you haven't heard of them.
No,
and so I actually met this founder through somewhat of a random intro, and I didn't really know much about them. Now, for some context, India has a huge ecosystem. And by the way, for your Indian listeners, I know this is super basic. Forgive me.
And give the TLDR of why it's a next consumer company.
It does huge ecosystem of these small stores. They're called Kirana stores, but basically these small mom and pop stores at the end of your street where you can buy everything from like stationery to basic groceries to, I think at the time they used to cigarettes, like just this basic mom and pop store, which exists at the end of the street. This huge ecosystem. Think like very small scale SMBs. And what Kata Book does is it's an app which tracks, account deliverables and receivables. Now, in the past, or at least today, most of these stores would have this dusty book which they would pull out and be like, well, this vendor owes me 500 rupees for this. I need to pay this guy 800 rupees for that. And they have this dusty book they would keep. This is an Android app which basically takes over that. Now, this is interesting. Right? I was like, okay, that's an interesting proposition. But Ravish, the founder, has spent so much time, talking to these store owners. And what he has done is inside the app, he's built a network effect, because now when the app tracks what these account deliverables and receivables are. Two is when you want to pay someone, you do it using the app. And now what happened, the second storekeeper goes like, well, hey, what is this app that this person is using to pay me with? And it then signs them up. So very quickly, they're able to build a picture of how these, I would say, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of SMBs work with each other, what their financial transactions are, and build a really interesting picture. Now you can see how this opens up all sorts of interesting opportunities, because you now have such a clear picture of how commerce is flowing across this part of India. So anyway, so I knew nothing about the space, and I know nothing about these small stores in India, but I met Ravish and I was just blown away, because he had spent so much time with them, and then he had built this, incredible product which has distribution as such a core element in itself, because every time a storekeeper sends one, they're like, hey, what is this app? And they wind up adopting it, and it's super interesting. So I think that kind of checks all these check boxes.
And just to play it out for a sec, why could there be $100 billion consumer social company in India in the next few years?
Few things. I think, I'll give you sort of the BCS intellectual framework and then sort of the cultural framework. I think the two intellectual frameworks are, with Geo, by the way, is this 4G data connectivity built by India's largest telco operator, Reliance, which basically brought 4G at very cheap prices to a large part of India. I don't want to get into the details, just Google it, but I think it's been a sea change, because all of a sudden, hundreds of millions of people in India have access to 4G data connectivity, which they just didn't have in the past. And this, along with how the other operators have responded, I think has been a sea change. So in some ways, India's kind of skipped the PC desktop era and all of a sudden gone straight to mobile internet. And, this blows my mind. When I go to India now, I see people watching live streaming TV, on the road, which I don't even really see in the United States as much. So I think there's this sort of consumer behavior change happening in India thanks to Geo. That's one. Second, I think India has been really pushing the idea for digital stack. One key element I would point out is UPI. UPI is a United Payment interface which lets people transfer money between bank accounts instantly. Yeah. So, for example, if I want to send you money, it has two-factor auth, it auths me, and then there's instant money transfer from my account to your bank account instantly in a way which I still can't do in the United States today. Like if I had to send you money outside of Square Cash or Venmo, for example, I actually don't know how to do it instantly with my bank account, right? ACH is kind of this old outdated infrastructure, but India kind of, built this standard which a lot of these companies have adopted. So one, I think you have broad, data connectivity at super low prices. Second, you have payments at scale for a large part of India. And I think this has kind of opened up all sorts of interesting innovation in consumer experience. I think this is kind of the two big secular changes I've seen. The emotional change, I think, is and I think this will resonate with a lot of the Indian audience. When I grew up in India, the thing that you were told to do by your parents was be an engineer, be a doctor, get a safe job. It was sort of a very risk-averse way. And if you look at, for example, like what is put in pop culture, what the typical stereotypical protagonist would do, they'd be told to go get a safe job, right? But now I think entrepreneurship and startup founders have kind of taken that role, where when I talk to kids in India these days, they look up to the founders of Flipkart, they look up to the founder of Paytm or Freecharge or, Ola, and they look up to them as role models. And now, what blew my mind was when I was watching a, Bollywood movie recently, the protagonist, the hero, tells his mom, I want to start a startup. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is such a sea change in India. So I think there is a cultural shift around encouraging and being more accepting of being an entrepreneur. And just given the number of people that exist in India, the access to talent, just a talent pool there, I think it's going to open up like all sorts of interesting innovation. So we can spend an entire hour in India, but I'm really bullish. And I've been trying to spend more time there, just physically flying out there. And it's been super interesting.
That's a perfect place to wrap. My guest today has been Sriram Krishnan. Sriram, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. And watch out for Eric on TikTok any day now.
Stay tuned. And verify your account with Sriram. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.